and welcome to Crowvane Manor. Wherever you are, and whatever kind of night it's been, you've come to the right place to slow down. Let the world go quiet for a while. Out here, none of it needs your attention. Many of you return to these rooms night after night, and I'm grateful for that. There's a reason you keep coming back. The stories kept inside these walls aren't quite like the ones you'll hear anywhere else. Before we begin, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. I always enjoy reading them. And if these stories stay with you, a like and a subscribe help more than you know. Now get comfortable, breathe slow, and let's open the door together. I was staying at my parents' house when this happened. Their place is pretty isolated, basically in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town is about an hour away, so when I say it gets quiet at night, I mean completely quiet. There are no nearby stores, no traffic passing every few minutes, no people walking home from bars, no neighbors having conversations through thin apartment walls. Once everyone goes to bed and the lights are off, all you really hear is nature. During the day, I actually liked that. At night, it could feel different. My parents have a small guest house that is connected to their garage but separated from the main house. Whenever I stayed over, that was usually where I slept. It gave me privacy. I could stay awake reading or using my phone without bothering anyone, and my parents could sleep without hearing me moving around. Normally, I never had a problem with it. That summer night was warm, so I had the window open. It was around 1 in the morning. I was lying there reading a book. The room was quiet enough that turning a page sounded loud. There was no television playing, no music, nothing except me, the book, and whatever normal nighttime sounds were coming from outside. I was comfortable. Then I heard something moving through the grass. At first, I barely reacted. That was not unusual out there. Animals moved around the property all the time. Depending on the season, you could hear little things in the brush, insects, birds, or something larger crossing through the grass. If you live far enough into the country, you learn that nighttime does not mean nothing is moving outside. It usually means the opposite. So when I first heard the grass shifting, I kept reading. Then I realized the sound was getting closer. Slowly, not rushing, not bounding around like something small. There was a definite pattern to it. A movement. Pause. Another movement. The grass brushing against something. At that point, I lowered the book and listened. That was when I noticed the breathing. It was faint at first. A slow, rough sound. Raspy, I remember trying to identify it. Dog? No. At least it did not sound like one to me. My parents lived far enough out that I had heard plenty of animals before. I knew what dogs sounded like. I knew what wolves sounded like. I had heard cougars. Whatever was outside did not immediately fit any of those sounds in my mind. That was when I started getting uncomfortable. The breathing kept coming closer. So did the movement in the grass. It did not sound like an animal running past the guest house. It sounded like something approaching it. Approaching me. I stayed completely still. The open window suddenly stopped feeling like a nice way to let cool summer air into the room. It became an opening. There was nothing between me and whatever was outside except the screen, assuming even that was there and secure. I wanted to get up and close it. I really did. But getting up meant moving toward the window, and I could not make myself do that. The sound came closer. Grass shifting. Slow breathing. Another step. Then, another. It finally stopped directly outside my window. At least, that was exactly how it sounded. I could not see whatever was there. That was probably the worst part. If I had looked outside and seen a deer, the fear would have disappeared. If it was a dog, fine. If it was some wild animal passing through, at least I would know what I was dealing with. Instead, I had only sound. Then it exhaled. It was heavy, loud, animal-like. The breath came out in one long release, right outside the window. I remember every hair on my body standing up. I felt completely frozen. There is a difference between thinking something may be outside and hearing something breathe close enough that you can imagine its face on the other side of the wall. I held still. Then it inhaled, very slowly. That was the part that truly terrified me. It sounded deliberate, a long breath being pulled inward. At the time, my immediate thought was that it was smelling me. It knew I was there. It could smell my fear. Obviously, I cannot know that. Fear itself does not necessarily have some magical scent an animal is consciously recognizing. But in that moment, the inhalation sounded exactly like an animal testing the air, trying to identify whatever was inside the room, trying to identify me. I wanted to close the window more than anything, but I could not move. My body had gone into that strange state where every instinct tells you that if you stay perfectly still, whatever is outside might leave. I was afraid that standing up would make noise. The bed might creak. The floor might move. The window could make a loud sound when I pulled it shut. And if the thing outside had not noticed me yet, moving might make it notice. So I stayed there. I do not know how long I held my breath. It felt like forever. In reality, it was probably only seconds. But every second stretched. I could hear my heartbeat. I was terrified that even that was too loud. I remember staring toward the window, even though I could not really see anything outside. The darkness beyond it felt solid. I kept expecting a face to rise into view. A muzzle, eyes, a hand. Anything, nothing appeared. There was only the breathing. Then the grass moved again. Slowly, the thing started walking away. I listened as carefully as I could. The sound moved farther from the window, grass brushing. A few more slow movements. The breathing became quieter. Then, eventually, I could not hear it anymore. I still did not move immediately. I stayed frozen in bed, listening for it to come back. Part of me thought it was still outside and had simply stopped making noise. Maybe it had moved around the side of the guest house. Maybe it was waiting. I do not know how long I stayed like that before I finally felt safe enough to move. I did not go outside to investigate. Absolutely not. Whatever had been there could still have been close. Even if it was an ordinary animal, walking outside at 1 a.m. to find it would have been a terrible idea. Eventually, I made it through the night. When I told my parents, they did not take the story as seriously as I did. They basically thought living in the city had made me jumpy. To them, strange animals outside were just part of living in the country. Something had walked by. I had heard it. I frightened myself. End of story. They did not think some unknown creature had been standing outside the guest house. I understood why they reacted that way. From their perspective, they had lived there long enough to hear animals at night without panicking. I had been alone in a dark guest room with an open window, listening to something I could not see. Those are very different experiences. Still, I kept insisting that whatever I heard did not sound normal to me. I had heard dogs. I had heard wolves. I had heard cougars. I knew the kinds of animal sounds I expected. This breathing did not match them. At least not in the conditions I was used to hearing them. That last part matters more to me now. Hearing an animal from a distance is completely different from hearing it directly outside an open window. Sound changes depending on distance, direction, walls, vegetation, and whether the animal is calm, exhausted, injured, feeding, sniffing, or simply breathing heavily. A familiar animal can sound completely unfamiliar when all you hear is one part of it. If I normally heard wolves howling from farther away, that does not mean I would instantly recognize a wolf breathing a few feet away. The same is true for dogs or any other animal. We think we know what animals sound like because we know their most recognizable noises. A dog barks. A wolf howls. A cougar screams or growls. But animals make many smaller noises that most of us rarely notice. Snorts, huffs, grunts, wheezes, panting, breathing through the nose, breathing through the mouth. An animal with an irritated airway could sound completely different from a healthy one. Something that had been running before approaching the guest house could have been breathing harder than normal. Even an animal I had heard 100 times might have seemed unknown under those circumstances. There is also the problem of the open window. The wall and window frame could have changed the sound. If an animal was breathing just below the window, the sound could have reflected upward and into the room. That might make it seem louder, deeper, or closer than it really was. The guest house being connected to the garage could also affect acoustics. Hard exterior walls reflect sound. Grass and open ground absorb some frequencies, while walls reflect others. What reaches your ear may not sound exactly like the animal itself. And at 1 in the morning, when there is almost no background noise, a single breath can seem enormous. During the day, the same sound might disappear beneath wind, cars, voices, or equipment. At night, it becomes the only thing in the world. Another possibility is that the animal was closer to the window than I realized, but smaller than I imagined. That sounds strange, but without seeing something, your brain estimates size partly from volume. Loud breathing becomes a large creature. Heavy movement becomes heavy body weight. But those assumptions can be wrong. A smaller animal very close to you can sound much larger than a large animal farther away. Dry grass can also amplify movement. Something stepping through tall or stiff grass can make a surprising amount of noise. The sound I interpreted as slow footsteps may not even have been individual feet. It could have been an animal pushing its body through vegetation. I also cannot completely rule out a person. I do not think it was human. The breathing sounded animalistic to me. The movement felt wrong for a person. But I never saw what was there. That means I cannot say with certainty. A person breathing heavily through the nose or mouth could sound rough. Someone moving slowly through grass outside a window would be frightening for much more grounded reasons than a mysterious animal. But there were no voices, no knock, no attempt to open the window, no footsteps on harder ground that I remember. And the way it moved away sounded more like an animal than someone walking upright. Still, because I could not see it, I have to leave that possibility open. Maybe there was an animal sniffing around the guest house. That actually makes a lot of sense. Human buildings attract animals for all kinds of reasons. Food smells, garbage, rodents, warmth, water, interesting scents. If I had the window open, air from the room would have been moving outside. My scent would have been going with it. The long inhale that frightened me may really have been the animal sniffing, not because it sensed fear in some supernatural way, just because there was a new smell coming through the window. A human. Soap, food, fabric, whatever was in the room. Animals investigate unfamiliar scents. If it walked toward the window because it smelled something, stopped to sniff, then decided there was nothing interesting, and walked away, the whole event becomes completely normal. Terrifying from my side of the wall. Normal from its side. I sometimes wonder whether it could have been a large herbivore. People often imagine danger when they hear heavy breathing, But deer and similar animals can make surprisingly strong snorting or blowing sounds. A startled animal can exhale sharply. Something investigating a building might breathe loudly enough to scare anyone who cannot see it. Depending on the area, there could also have been other large animals I did not immediately consider. I do not know exactly what lived around the property at the time. That makes identifying it from memory impossible. I only know what I thought it was not. And even that judgment was made while terrified. Fear changes hearing, too. When you become afraid, you start focusing intensely on threat-related sounds. Your brain tries to determine how close, how big, moving toward me or away, predator or harmless. Every noise becomes meaningful. A raspy breath is not simply a breath anymore. It becomes something hunting. A slow inhale becomes something smelling you. Grass moving becomes something stalking you. That does not mean the sounds were imaginary. I definitely heard something outside. But the meaning I assigned to those sounds was shaped by fear. There is a huge difference between an unidentified animal sniffed near my window and something inhuman came to my window and smelled my fear. The raw sounds could fit both stories. The first one is much more likely. At the time, though, the second one is what my body believed. The isolation made it much worse. The main house was nearby, but not connected directly to where I was sleeping. That mattered psychologically. If I had been in a bedroom down the hall from my parents, I could have called out. I could have opened the door and gone to them. In the guest house, there was a feeling of being on my own. To reach the main house, I would have had to leave my immediate safe space. At 1 in the morning, with something breathing outside, that was not happening. My phone may have been nearby, but I was so frozen that even reaching for it felt risky. Again, the threat may have been completely harmless. But when you cannot identify it, caution takes over. I also think about why I could not close the window. People sometimes imagine they would act bravely in frightening situations. They would jump out of bed, shut the window, turn on all the lights, grab something for protection, call somebody. Reality can be very different. Sometimes you freeze. The body seems to decide that movement is more dangerous than stillness. That was me. I knew the open window was the thing making me feel vulnerable. Closing it was the obvious solution. Yet closing it required getting within arm's reach of whatever might be directly underneath it. I could not do that. The fear of seeing something rise into the window as I approached was stronger than the fear of leaving it open. So, I waited. In a strange way, hearing it walk away was almost worse for the first few seconds. When the sound started moving, I did not know which direction it was going. Was it leaving? Was it circling the building? Was it heading toward the door? I had to listen until the noise became faint enough to know it was getting farther away. Only then could I breathe properly again. I never heard it return. That matters. There was no scratching on the wall, no attack, no damage to the window, no tracks that I know of, nothing missing outside, no livestock harmed, no repeated nightly visits. Whatever it was, it approached once and left. That strongly supports an ordinary animal explanation. It may never have known I was frightened. It may never even have known exactly what I was. It smelled something coming from the building, investigated, and moved on. From the animal's perspective, nothing happened. From mine, it became one of the most frightening nights I can remember. I wish I had looked for tracks the next morning. That might have solved everything. There may have been prints directly under the window. A hoof, a paw, something unmistakable. But I do not remember finding anything or even checking carefully. By daylight, the urgency was gone. And once my parents laughed it off, I probably began questioning whether investigating would accomplish anything. Maybe tracks were there and nobody noticed. Maybe the ground was too hard to hold them. Maybe grass covered everything. That missed opportunity is one reason the story remained unresolved. If I had recorded the breathing, someone might identify it immediately today. But who thinks to record when they are lying in bed, convinced some unknown animal is inches from an open window? I was not thinking like a researcher. I was trying not to move. My parents' reaction was frustrating, but I understand it better now. They were used to the property. They knew local animals came through. To them, I probably sounded like someone from the city discovering for the first time that the countryside is full of nighttime noises. Maybe they were right. Maybe familiarity would have changed everything. If I had spent another year sleeping there, I might eventually have heard the same sound again and realized, oh, that is what that was. Sometimes the only difference between a terrifying unknown sound and an ordinary one is hearing it twice. The first time, your imagination has unlimited possibilities. The second time, maybe you see the deer making it. Mystery over. I never got that second encounter. So my memory kept the first one exactly as it felt. Something moving closer. Something breathing. Something stopping outside my window. A slow inhale. Then leaving. I am still uncomfortable sleeping with windows open when I am in the country. Intellectually, I know a closed window would not necessarily stop every real danger, and most animals outside have no interest in coming into a bedroom. But the emotional association remains. Open window means I can hear what is out there. More importantly, it means what is out there can potentially hear and smell me, too. That night permanently changed the feeling of an open window. In a city, an open window lets in traffic noise, voices, maybe music. In the country, it can feel like an opening directly into darkness. And darkness in the country is not empty. There are animals moving through it all night, whether you see them or not. I think that is the most grounded way to understand what happened. Something alive was outside. I have no reason to doubt that. The grass moved. The breathing got closer. The sound stopped near the window. Then it moved away. The mistake would be assuming that because I could not identify it. It must have been something impossible. There are too many ordinary animals capable of making sounds I might not recognize under unusual conditions. It could have been an animal I knew sounding different from what I expected. It could have been one I had rarely heard up close. It could have been injured, tired, or simply sniffing. The darkness removed every visual clue that would normally help me identify it. All I had was sound. And fear filled in everything sound could not tell me. Still, there is one detail I cannot remember without getting chills. That inhale. The exhale was scary enough. It announced that something was there. But the inhale felt intentional, slow, deep, as though it had reached the window and stopped because it had found exactly what it was looking for. I know now that animals smell things. That is ordinary. Whatever was outside may have caught my scent and investigated. There's nothing supernatural about that. But lying there at 1 in the morning, alone in a guest house an hour from the nearest town, I did not think. A local animal is displaying normal scent investigation behavior. I thought, it knows I am here. That thought completely locked my body. I have never forgotten it. Maybe my parents were right, and the country simply got to me. Maybe if they had been sleeping in that room, they would have heard the same breathing and immediately named the animal. Maybe they would have rolled over and gone back to sleep. I wish I had been able to do that. Instead, I lay there holding my breath, listening to something I could not identify breathe on the other side of an open window. Years later, I do not claim it was a monster. I do not claim it was supernatural. I do not even claim it was an animal nobody had ever heard of. The most likely explanation is much simpler. Some ordinary creature wandered close to the guest house, detected a human scent, stopped to investigate, and continued on its way. But being able to say that now does not change what it felt like then. The silence, the grass, shifting, the rough breathing getting closer one slow movement at a time. Then, nothing between me and the sound except an open window. A heavy exhale, a pause, and that long, slow breath inward. I stayed perfectly still until it finally began walking away. I never saw what was outside. Maybe that is why the memory still bothers me. If I had seen it, I would have a name for it. Instead, all I have is the sound of something standing in the darkness beneath my window, breathing heavily enough for me to hear every breath, and the memory of being too terrified to move the few feet it would have taken to close the window. When I was 12 years old, I shared a bedroom with my younger brother, who was about 5 years younger than me. Our beds were in the same room, and above mine there was a small window set into the wall. It was not a huge window. From what I remember, it was maybe a foot or two tall, and it sat roughly 4 feet above the top of my bed. I was used to it being there. During the day, it was just part of the room. At night, I rarely thought about it. My brother and I had probably slept in that room hundreds of times without anything strange happening. Then one night, I woke up suddenly, not gradually. There was no slow process where I became aware of the room and realized I was awake. One moment, I was asleep. The next, my eyes were open, and almost immediately, I had one of the strangest feelings I have ever experienced. I knew something was about to hit the wall. Not suspected, not worried. Knew that is the part that has always bothered me. There was no obvious reason for me to think it. I had not heard the banging yet. I did not remember hearing footsteps outside. Nothing had touched the window. My brother was still asleep. The room seemed quiet. But the moment I woke up, I had this overwhelming certainty that in a few seconds, something was going to pound on the wall beside or above my bed. I remember lying there waiting for it. My whole body had gone tense. Maybe 4 seconds passed. Then it happened. Bang! The sound was incredibly loud. It hit the wall so hard that whatever tiny bit of doubt I had disappeared instantly. Then more pounding. I could not tell whether it was coming from inside the wall or from the outside of the house. That uncertainty made it worse. If I had immediately recognized someone knocking at a door, at least I would understand what kind of sound I was hearing. This was more violent than that. It sounded like something striking the wall. Hard, close. I was directly underneath that window, and suddenly the entire area above my bed felt unsafe. I froze. Then, right after the banging, I heard another noise from near the window. It sounded like a bird taking off. A loud burst of wings, something launching itself away from the windowsill. The sound was quick, but I remember it distinctly. There was the pounding. Then, what sounded like wings beating hard as something left the window. That was enough for me. I got out of that room as fast as I could. And yes, I left my little brother behind. He was still asleep, completely unaware. There was probably a moment where I could have thought I should wake him up. I did not. My 12-year-old brain had one plan: get to my parents. So I ran. I left my younger brother sleeping in the room and went straight to my parents' bedroom. Looking back, I feel slightly bad about that. He was 7. If I genuinely believed something terrifying was attacking the wall outside our bedroom, abandoning him was not exactly the heroic older brother response. But I have zero regrets about the decision I made in the moment. Fear won. Whatever was happening, I wanted an adult between me and it. I stayed with my parents while my brother apparently continued sleeping through the whole thing. That almost makes the story funny now. Almost at the time, there was nothing funny about it. What stayed with me was not even the banging itself. It was waking up before it happened and somehow being certain that it was coming. That is the part I could never easily explain. If the wall had suddenly been hit and startled me awake, simple, an animal, a branch, something outside. But in my memory, I woke first. I had that strange thought. Then, seconds later, the exact thing I expected happened. For years, I wondered how that was possible. Had I somehow sensed it before it happened? Was something standing outside the window? Had whatever was there somehow caused me to wake up? Or was the whole sequence less mysterious than it felt? As I got older, I started thinking about the event differently. One possibility is that the banging did not truly begin after I woke up. Maybe the first impact happened while I was still asleep. My brain heard it. That sound woke me. But because waking is not always instantaneous, my conscious memory may begin a few seconds later. By the time I became fully aware, all I had was a powerful expectation that another impact was coming. Then the second bang happened. From my point of view, I woke up. I knew something was about to hit the wall. Then it did. But the real sequence might have been something hit the wall. The sound partially woke me. My brain registered danger before I became fully conscious. I woke with the expectation that the sound would repeat. Then it repeated. That explanation actually makes a lot of sense. Sleep and waking are not always cleanly separated. You can hear alarms in dreams. Someone can say your name and you incorporate it into whatever you are dreaming before you wake. A door can slam, and in the final seconds of a dream, your mind can build an entire scene around the sound. Then you wake, believing the dream happened before the noise. Maybe something similar happened to me. The first impact may have been absorbed into sleep. My brain recognized the pattern. The next conscious thought was, something is about to bang on the wall. Then, predictably, it happened again. That would create an extremely convincing sense of prediction without requiring anything supernatural. Another possibility is that I heard something quieter before the banging. Scratching, movement, a bird shifting on the windowsill, claws against the outside wall, a rustling sound. Maybe those noises woke me. I did not consciously remember them, but my brain used them to predict what was coming. If a large bird was struggling or moving around directly above my bed, it might have made softer noises first. Then, it struck the siding or window. My nervous system could have heard the early movement and woken me before the loudest impact. That would feel exactly like instinct. Something in me knew. But maybe something in me had actually heard it. The bird-like sound afterward is a huge clue. I have always described it as sounding like a bird taking off. If that is accurate, then an animal explanation becomes very plausible. A bird may have landed on the windowsill, maybe a fairly large one. If it became startled, trapped, or confused, it could have beaten its wings against the wall or window. A large bird launching suddenly from very close range can sound much louder than people expect. Wings hitting siding, glass, or a window frame could easily produce a violent banging noise, especially in a silent bedroom at night. Something like an owl might be one possibility. Depending on where you live, other nocturnal birds could also land around buildings. A bird could have been hunting something near the window. Maybe there were insects attracted by light. Maybe a small animal was close to the house. Maybe the bird tried landing on the sill, lost its footing, struck the wall several times, then flew away. From inside, with no visual information, it could sound like someone pounding directly on the wall. I do not know what kind of bird it would have been. I never saw it. But the wing-like takeoff sound is hard to ignore. There could also have been another animal outside. A squirrel. A raccoon. Something climbing. An animal could have struck the wall and then startled a bird that had been resting nearby. In that case, the pounding and the wing noise would come from two different animals. At 12 years old, I naturally connected them into one event. Something hit the wall. Then, something flew away. Therefore, the thing hitting the wall flew away. Maybe, but they could have been separate. There is also a structural possibility. Houses make strange noises. Wood expands and contracts with temperature. Pipes knock. Heating or cooling systems cause sudden pops. Wind puts pressure on siding. Branches hit walls. A strong enough structural pop can sound like somebody hitting the house. If a bird happened to be sitting on the sill when the wall or window made a sudden noise, the bird might have panicked and flown away. Then the entire event would be house makes loud bang. Bird is startled. Bird launches from window. I wake. Everything fits. The only difficult part is the timing of my certainty. But again, sleep state perception could explain that. Maybe there had been a quieter structural sound first. Maybe I woke between repeated pops. Maybe my memory compressed the event afterward. Memory timing is especially unreliable when you are startled awake. 4 seconds can feel exact in memory while being much shorter or longer in reality. I say it was about 4 seconds because that is how I remember it. I was not looking at a clock. I did not count out loud. I woke with a feeling. Then the banging came. The gap could have been 1 second. It could have been 6. Maybe the thought and the sound were almost simultaneous, but memory separated them. That would reduce the mystery considerably. Still, I remember the certainty, not just fear. Certainty. That is what makes the story stick with me. There is a difference between waking up nervous and waking up knowing exactly what kind of sound you are about to hear. I did not think something bad is going to happen. I thought something was going to pound on the wall. Then it did. That specificity is why the experience felt almost supernatural. But the brain is very good at making predictions from incomplete information. We do it constantly without realizing it. You hear the first half of a familiar sound and know the rest is coming. A car passes outside, and you know the trailer behind it will rattle. A person climbs the stairs, and you know which step will creak. You hear something fall and tense before the second object hits the floor. The prediction feels instantaneous because the brain processes patterns extremely fast. If I heard one faint scrape or impact while half asleep, that may have been enough. My conscious mind woke only with the prediction. Then, the next impact confirmed it. That is probably the most reasonable explanation for the warning. The banging itself could also have sounded stranger because of where I was positioned. My bed was underneath the window. Sound coming through a wall can be difficult to locate. Low-frequency impacts travel through framing. Something hitting the outside siding may sound like it is inside the wall. Something inside a wall can sound external. That matches my memory perfectly because I could not decide where the pounding came from. I remember thinking it might be inside the wall. That is a horrible thought at 12. If something is outside, there's at least a wall between you and it. If the sound is inside the wall, then what? Animal? Pipes? Something crawling through the structure? My imagination did not need much encouragement. The room was dark. My brother was asleep. The noise was directly above me. I was already in fight-or-flight mode. I chose flight, very enthusiastically. I do wonder how my brothers slept through it. If the banging was as loud as I remember, why did he not wake up? There are several possibilities. Some kids sleep through almost anything. He was younger. Maybe he was a very deep sleeper. His bed may have been farther from the window. The wall could have directed more of the sound toward me. I was already partly awake, so the noise seemed much louder to me. Or maybe he did stir and simply did not remember. The fact that he remained asleep does not mean the sound did not happen. But it does make me wonder whether my state between sleep and wakefulness amplified it. Sounds can feel enormous when they wake you suddenly. An ordinary knock can become explosive because your brain jumps from deep sleep to full alarm in an instant. The darkness does the rest. I also have to consider whether part of the experience could have been a dream. I do not think the entire thing was. I remember getting up. I remember leaving the room. I remember going to my parents. So I was definitely awake by that point. But the first few seconds after waking may have contained dream material. There is a state between sleep and full waking where dream images, sounds, or expectations can continue briefly. You do not need to see a full hallucination. Sometimes it is just a feeling that someone is in the room, or that something is about to happen. Maybe my certainty about the wall came from whatever I had been dreaming immediately before I woke. Then, a real sound outside happened to match it. That would be an incredible coincidence. But coincidences happen. Suppose I had been dreaming that someone was knocking. I wake. Seconds later, a bird hits the siding. The two events become linked forever. That is possible. I do not remember what I was dreaming beforehand, so I cannot test it. There is also a chance that a bird struck the window rather than simply taking off from it. Birds sometimes collide with glass. At night, reflections and indoor light can confuse them. A bird hitting a window can sound shockingly loud. If it struck the window more than once or flapped against the frame trying to recover, I could easily interpret it as pounding on the wall. Then, once it regained control, I would hear the wings taking off. That may be the simplest physical explanation of all. Bird contacts, window or wall. Repeated impact. Wings, gone, no ghost. No person, no creature inside the wall. Just a terrified bird having an equally bad night. From its point of view, maybe it flew toward a reflection, collided with a building, panicked, flapped against the siding, and escaped. Meanwhile, inside, a 12-year-old abandoned his little brother and ran to his parents. If that is what happened, I almost feel sorry for the bird. Almost another possibility is that something larger brushed against the house and disturbed a bird from the windowsill. If there was a tree near the window, a branch could have struck the wall. Wind can move branches suddenly, even when the air seems calm at ground level. The bird, startled by the impact, takes off. Again, the sounds combine perfectly. Branch, bang. Bird wings. At night, I would have no way to separate them. I do not remember checking outside the next morning for branches, feathers, marks, or anything else. I wish I had. One feather on the ground beneath the window could have made the entire experience much less mysterious. But children do not always investigate strange things the next day. By morning, the world feels normal again. Sunlight makes the same wall harmless. You have breakfast. Go to school. Maybe your parents tell you it was a bird. Eventually, the evidence disappears. What stays is the memory. I also wonder whether my parents gave me any explanation. I remember going to their room, but I do not remember the whole conversation afterward. Maybe they told me it was an animal. Maybe they barely woke up. Maybe I slept there for the rest of the night. Those details are not as clear as the sound itself. Again, that tells me how memory prioritizes fear. I remember the warning, the bang, the wings, the escape. Everything afterward is softer. Over time, I started finding the story funny because of what I did to my brother. I can admit it. I absolutely left him behind. I did not wake him. I did not heroically stand between his bed and the mysterious thing outside. I ran to my parents like my life depended on it. If whatever was outside wanted a 7-year-old, apparently that was his problem. I feel slightly guilty saying that. But I also remember being 12. You do not make calm, tactical decisions when you wake up convinced something is about to attack your wall. You react. My brother was asleep. My parents were safety. So I went to safety. The humor only came later. The fear was very real. I think the most unsettling part was feeling like whatever was outside had somehow announced itself before making the sound. That is why, even after considering birds and structural noises, I still sometimes think about those few seconds. Why did I wake up? Why did I know? There is a grounded answer. My sleeping brain probably heard something before my conscious brain did. Maybe scratching. Maybe the first impact. Maybe wings shifting on the sill. That hidden sound woke me and created the expectation. It is actually fascinating how much information the brain processes while we sleep. A parent can sleep through traffic, but wake immediately when their child makes an unusual sound. People wake moments before alarms because their sleep cycle and internal clock anticipate the time. You can become conscious of danger cues before you understand them. So maybe there was no mysterious warning at all. My ears were working. My brain was working. I simply became consciously aware halfway through the sequence. That is probably the explanation I believe most now. Something was already happening at the window. My brain detected it. I woke. The next sound came. It felt prophetic because I did not remember the first cue. Then, the bird took off. Everything else was fear. If that is what happened, then the experience is actually a good example of how instinct can feel supernatural while being completely physical. Your body knows before you know. You wake with certainty. Then reality confirms it. The conscious mind sees only the prediction and the result, not the sensory information that connected them. That is enough to create a mystery. Still, when I picture that bedroom, I understand exactly why 12-year-old me did not stop to analyze neuroscience. I was lying under a small window in the middle of the night. I opened my eyes with the strongest feeling that something was about to pound directly on the wall above me. A few seconds later, something did, loud enough to make me think it could be inside the wall. Then came the sudden explosive sound of wings right outside the window. At that moment, I did not think. Probably an owl experiencing difficulty with the architecture. I thought, get out. So I did. Years later, I am willing to believe a bird explains nearly all of it. Maybe a bird landed awkwardly on the sill. Maybe it struck the wall or glass. Maybe a branch or some other noise scared it away. Maybe the first movement woke me before the loud impact. There is no need for a supernatural explanation. Nothing appeared inside the room. Nothing followed me. Nothing happened to my brother. There was no second incident. That is important. If something strange had been deliberately trying to frighten us, it apparently gave up after one round of pounding. An animal makes much more sense. And yet, I still remember those 4 seconds before the bang. That is the little part that refuses to become completely ordinary. Not because it cannot be explained, it can, but because of how it felt. I did not wake wondering what had disturbed me. I woke waiting. My eyes opened. My body tensed. And before anything loud happened, I was absolutely certain something was about to strike the wall above my bed. Then it did. Maybe my sleeping brain had already heard the first sound. Maybe that is all it was. I hope so. Because if there is one part of the story I would rather not believe was supernatural, it is not the banging or the bird taking off. It is the idea that for a few seconds in the middle of the night, something outside my window somehow let me know exactly what it was about to do before it did it. Either way, I did not stay around to find out. The moment I heard those wings leave the windowsill, I was out of bed and heading for my parents' room. My little brother remained behind, sleeping peacefully through the entire thing. I still feel a little bad about that. But if I woke up tonight with that same absolute certainty that something was about to pound on the wall above me, followed seconds later by a violent bang and wings exploding away from the window, I would like to say I would handle it more bravely now. I probably would not. I would just make sure to wake my brother this time. I was around 11 or 12 when this happened. At that age, I had gone through a phase where I was constantly afraid that someone might break into our house during the night. I do not remember exactly what started it. Maybe I had heard a story about a robbery. Maybe I saw something on television. Maybe it was just one of those fears children sometimes develop once they become old enough to understand that bad things can actually happen. Whatever caused it, the fear became part of my nighttime routine. Every night, after getting into bed, I would stare at my bedroom door. I would listen for footsteps, a creak in the hallway, a door moving, a strange sound downstairs. Anything, even the smallest noise, could wake me. I would immediately think someone had gotten into the house. Sometimes I imagined a burglar. Other times I imagined being kidnapped. I knew, logically, that my family was nearby and that our house was probably completely safe. But fear does not always care about logic, especially when you are 11 years old, lying awake in a dark bedroom. The door became the place I watched. If something bad was going to enter my room, I was convinced it would come through there. One night, sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up because I needed to use the bathroom. That alone was annoying because I hated getting out of bed at night. When you are already afraid of someone being inside your house, walking into a dark hallway is not exactly relaxing. Still, I needed to go. I got up, went to the bathroom. Nothing happened. The hallway was empty. The house was quiet. I finished and went back to my room. I got into bed again and pulled the blankets around myself. Normally, after waking up like that, I would struggle to fall asleep again because my brain immediately returned to listening. That night was no different. I lay there staring toward the bedroom door. Waiting, listening, there was nothing unusual. No footsteps, no voices, no doors opening. Just the normal quiet of the house at night. Eventually, I started getting sleepy again. My eyes became heavier. I was still watching the door, but I could feel myself slowly drifting off. That point between being fully awake and fully asleep always feels strange when I think about it now. You are aware of the room. You know where you are. But thoughts start becoming less organized. Shapes become less clear. Your mind begins moving toward dreams while part of you is still watching the real world. I was right at that point when I noticed something near the door. A shadow. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. There were always shadows in the room. Furniture, clothes, light coming through windows, darkness from the hallway. The outline could have been anything. But something about this one felt wrong. I kept looking. The longer I watched, the more it seemed like the shape of a person, a man. My first thought was not ghost. It was burglar. That is important. I was already afraid of burglars. So when my half-asleep brain saw what looked like a human figure near the bedroom door, it immediately gave that shape the identity I feared most. Someone had broken into the house. Someone was inside my bedroom. I did not scream. I did not call for my parents. I froze. I pulled the blanket higher over my face and left only one eye uncovered so I could keep watching. I thought if the man did not know I was awake, maybe I would be safer. I remember being afraid even to breathe normally. The figure seemed completely black. I could not make out any facial features. No eyes, no mouth, no clothes, no skin. Just the shape of a person standing in the darkness. I stared through that tiny opening in the blanket. Then the figure seemed to move closer. Slowly, I felt my entire body tighten. It came farther into the room. I still could not see any details. That almost made it worse. If I had seen a face, maybe I could have recognized someone. My father, another family member, someone who had entered the wrong room. But there was nothing to recognize, only darkness shaped like a person. The figure kept coming toward the bed. I wanted to move. I could not. I remember thinking about what I should do if it reached me. Should I jump up? Should I attack? Should I scream? Should I stay completely still and pretend I was asleep? Every option seemed dangerous. If it was a burglar and I attacked, what if he had a weapon? If I screamed, what if that made him hurt me? If I stayed still, what if he was already planning to do something? I could not decide. So I did nothing. I lay there. Frozen, the figure came closer. Closer until it was right beside the bed. Then it felt as though it leaned over me. That is the part I remember most strongly. I could feel the presence of something hovering directly above me, looking down at me. I still could not see a face, but I was absolutely convinced that it was watching me. The blanket was still over most of my face. I kept one eye open. I stared upward at this dark shape, and I held my breath. At least, I remember holding my breath. It felt like I did it for 2 minutes. Realistically, it was probably much shorter. Holding your breath for that long while already terrified would be extremely difficult. But fear destroys your sense of time. 10 seconds can feel endless. I remember my lungs starting to hurt. My chest felt tight. I was terrified that if I breathed loudly, the figure would know I was awake. So I tried to stay completely still. It did not touch me. It did not speak. It did not raise a hand. It just seemed to hover over me. Watching, I remember thinking that this was it. Whatever I had spent night after night being afraid of had finally happened. Someone had come through the door. They were standing over my bed. I was trapped underneath the blanket. Then, just when I thought I could not hold my breath any longer, the figure started moving away. Slowly, it backed away from the bed. I stayed completely still. I watched it move toward the door. Then it was gone. Just like that. No footsteps, no door opening, no floorboards creaking. Nothing. That was one of the strangest parts. If it had been an actual person, I would have expected to hear something. Even someone trying to be quiet makes noise. Clothing moves. Feet touch the floor. A door shifts. A hallway creaks. But once the figure moved away, there was only silence. I did not hear it leave the house. I did not hear it go down the hallway. I did not hear anything at all. I stayed in bed. I do not remember running to my parents. I do not remember checking the hallway. I think I was too frightened to move for a while. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. The next day, the house was normal. Nothing was missing. There was no broken window that I knew of, no sign that someone had forced the door. My family never said a stranger had been inside. Nothing happened that confirmed a burglar had actually entered the house. I also did not tell my family, at least not seriously. I was convinced they would laugh at me or say I had been dreaming. Maybe they would call me crazy, so I kept it to myself. For a long time, I barely even thought about it, because thinking about it brought the fear back. The experience had been too real. That is the strange thing about it. Even years later, I can remember how certain I was that someone was in the room. I did not experience it like a dream. I experienced it like waking up and seeing a man. But looking back now, I think the fact that I was drifting back to sleep is probably the most important detail in the entire story. I had woken up, used the bathroom, returned to bed, then lay staring at the door until my eyes were becoming too heavy to keep open. I was right on the edge of sleep. There are states around falling asleep and waking where dreamlike imagery can overlap with awareness of the real room. A person may feel awake because they can see their bedroom. They know where the door is. They recognize their bed. But the brain is already beginning to generate dream content. Sometimes that content appears inside the familiar room. A shadow becomes a person. A person seems to move closer. Someone feels a presence beside the bed. The experience can feel completely real because part of the environment actually is real. I cannot diagnose exactly what happened to me from one childhood memory, but some kind of sleep-related visual experience fits extremely well, especially because the figure had no details. It was just black, a human outline. That is exactly the kind of shape a half-asleep brain could build from ordinary darkness. My fear of burglars would have supplied the meaning. The room provides a shadow. My mind supplies a man. The fear supplies the story. He is coming toward me. He is standing over me. He is watching. There is another clue. I felt unable to move. At the time, I thought I was choosing not to move because I was afraid. That may be true, but it is also possible that I was in a state where movement felt unusually difficult because I was drifting into sleep. People can sometimes experience a sense of being frozen around sleep transitions. That does not necessarily mean anything serious is wrong. It can happen in otherwise healthy people. The experience can be terrifying because the mind feels awake while the body does not respond normally. If that happened to me, it would explain why I lay there debating whether to jump up, but never actually did it. I may not have been as physically capable of moving as I believed. That would also explain the intense sense of a presence hovering over me. That feeling is common in frightening sleep-related experiences. People describe somebody standing in the room, something sitting on the chest, a person leaning over the bed, a dark figure near the door. Different cultures give those figures different names, but the basic experience can happen without anything supernatural being present. I did not know that at 11 or 12. To me, a man was standing in my room. The timing also fits. I was not wide awake doing homework. I was not standing in the kitchen. I had just returned to bed in the middle of the night and was actively falling asleep. That is exactly when the boundary between dreaming and waking can become messy. Another possibility is that I was actually awake and misread a real shadow. Maybe something hanging near the door looked human. A coat, clothes on a chair, a towel, a bag. If the only light came from outside the room or from a window, normal objects could combine into a person-shaped silhouette. As my eyes became tired, small shifts in focus could make the shape seem to move. Our eyes are never perfectly still. In darkness, the brain has very little information to work with. If you stare at an unclear shape for long enough, it can seem to change. The edges move. The shape seems larger. Something stationary can appear to approach because your brain keeps revising its interpretation. That could explain the figure getting closer without there actually being a moving person. The blanket itself may have contributed. I had most of my face covered and was looking through a small opening with one eye. That narrows vision. It removes peripheral reference points. It can make distance harder to judge. If I was seeing a dark shape through a tiny gap, my brain may have had almost no reliable information about how far away it really was. The shape could seem close even if it remained near the doorway. And if I shifted under the blanket, the opening in front of my eye would move too. That could make the shadow appear to move across the room. There is also the possibility that somebody in my family really did enter briefly. Maybe one of my parents checked on us. Maybe someone walked past the doorway. In the darkness, I failed to recognize them. But the lack of footsteps and the way the figures seemed to disappear make that explanation less satisfying. A real family member would probably have had some identifiable detail. They might have spoken. They might have turned on a light. And I would expect to hear them leave. Still, I cannot completely rule it out. The most likely explanation to me remains some combination of darkness, fear, and being on the edge of sleep. The fact that I was already obsessed with listening for burglars is especially important. Night after night, I had trained my attention toward the door. I was waiting to see a threat there. That does not mean I wanted to imagine one. It means my brain had become extremely sensitive to anything human-shaped near that area. If you repeatedly stare into darkness, looking for a person, eventually a shadow may become one. The strange feeling that something was off could have been my brain noticing an ordinary shadow while I was drifting into sleep. Because I was already afraid. I did not think. That shape looks slightly different tonight. I thought, there is a man in my room. Once that interpretation locked in, every later perception followed it. The figure gets closer. Of course it does. A burglar would approach the bed. It stands over me. Of course. That is what I feared would happen. Then it leaves without making noise. That fits a dream like image fading as my level of consciousness changed. Maybe I became slightly more awake. The visual illusion dissolved. The figure did not physically walk away. My brain simply stopped generating it. But subjectively, it looked like a person retreating toward the door and disappearing. That explanation makes sense now. It would not have helped me at 12. There is another thing I think about. I said I held my breath for what felt like 2 minutes. That is a good example of how distorted the experience probably was. Fear makes time stretch. If the entire event lasted 30 seconds, it could easily feel much longer. If I was partly dreaming, time would be even less reliable. That means the figure may not have spent minutes standing over me. Maybe it was there for only a few seconds. But because those seconds were terrifying, my memory preserved them as something much longer. The same may be true of the movement. I remember the figure slowly approaching. Maybe there were only 2 or 3 moments where the shadow seemed closer. My memory then turned those separate impressions into continuous movement. That is how the brain often stores events, not as perfect video. As a story built from important pieces. Shadow at door. Closer, over bed. Leaving, gone, the emotional truth stays even if the exact timing changes. And the emotional truth is that I was terrified. That part was completely real. I remember the blanket over my face. I remember the one eye looking out. I remember trying not to breathe. I remember wondering whether I should attack. It is strange to think about an 11-year-old considering fighting a burglar in the dark. But that was what my mind was doing. I wanted to survive whatever I thought was happening. The fact that nothing happened afterward is also reassuring. No repeated figure, no break-in, no threatening person around the house, no signs of somebody targeting our family. If a real burglar had stood directly over my bed, the incident would probably have left physical evidence or had some larger consequence. It is possible someone entered and left without stealing anything, but that is far less likely than a sleep-related experience. The figure also behaved strangely for a burglar. It did not search drawers. It did not take anything. It did not react when I stared at it. It did not speak. It simply approached, hovered, and left. That is more like dream logic than criminal behavior. At the time, though, I did not analyze any of that. The fear of kidnapping or robbery had been with me for weeks or months. Then, one night, the fears seemed to become visible. That is probably why the experience traumatized me. It was not a random monster. It was the exact type of danger I had been preparing for every night. My own worst expectation appeared at the door. I also think not talking about it made the memory heavier. When you tell someone about a frightening experience immediately, sometimes they give you information that helps. Maybe my parents would have said, "Oh, I came into your room last night. Mystery solved." Or maybe they would have shown me a coat near the door that made the shape. Or told me about sleep-related hallucinations. Instead, I kept it inside. That left me alone with the most frightening explanation. A man came into my room, or something that looked like a man did. No one else knew. Nothing challenged the memory. Years passed. By then, the image had become part of me. I understand why I did not tell them. Children hate being laughed at. If you already expect someone to say you are crazy, silence feels safer. But silence also gives fear space to grow. Now I can look at the experience more calmly. I do not have to say I saw a ghost. I do not even have to say I saw a real person. I can admit that the timing around sleep makes a normal explanation very plausible. That does not mean I was lying. It does not mean I was being dramatic. A dream-like figure seen while partially awake can feel just as real as a person standing physically in the room. Your heart reacts the same way. Your fear is real. Your memory can be real. The interpretation is the uncertain part. I think the strongest explanation is that I was drifting into sleep while staring at the doorway, already primed to see a burglar. A dark shape became human. My awareness moved partly into a dream state. The figure seemed to approach. I felt frozen. It seemed to hover over me. Then, as I shifted back toward wakefulness, it faded or retreated. That covers almost every detail. It also explains why there were no footsteps. The figure did not need to physically cross the floor. The movement existed in perception. Still, even knowing all of that, I can understand why the memory stayed with me. There is something uniquely terrifying about seeing a human shape inside your bedroom. A monster would almost be easier. Monsters belong to imagination. Burglars exist. Kidnappers exist. At 11 or 12, I knew that. So the first second of seeing the figure was not supernatural fear. It was real-world fear. Someone is inside. That thought is enough to paralyze anybody. I remember thinking I might have to fight. I remember trying to decide whether making noise would save me or get me hurt. Those are not thoughts a child should have to process in bed. Even if the danger only existed in a half-asleep brain, the fear did not know that. It thought I was trapped. Maybe that is why I still remember the feeling of the figure leaning over me more clearly than I remember what happened the next morning. My brain treated that moment like a threat to survival. It saved it. Everything ordinary afterward disappeared. I do not know what time it was. I do not remember the next breakfast. I do not remember school that day. But I remember one black shape. I remember the door behind it. I remember darkness where a face should have been, and I remember holding my breath under a blanket while I waited for it to decide what it was going to do. If I could go back and talk to my younger self, I would probably tell him not to attack it. I would tell him to try moving a finger. Turn on a light if possible. Call for a parent. Look at the room directly instead of through a tiny opening in the blanket. Those things might have broken the experience immediately. But none of that occurred to me at the time. I was 11 or 12. I did what scared children often do. I hid. I stayed quiet. I waited for the danger to leave. And eventually, it did. That is why, when I think about the incident now, I do not focus on whether ghosts are real. I focus on how convincing perception can be when fear and sleep overlap. Maybe there was never anyone in my room. Maybe my brain created exactly the intruder I had spent night after night expecting. Maybe the shadow near the door was ordinary until I gave it a human shape. Those explanations make sense. They are probably right. But memory does not replay explanations. It replays the experience. The bathroom trip. Getting back into bed. Staring at the door. My eyes becoming heavy. The shadow. The feeling that something was wrong. Then a black figure slowly separating itself from the darkness and coming toward me. No face. No sound. No footsteps. Just closer, until it seemed to be leaning directly over my bed. I remember my lungs hurting because I was afraid to breathe. I remember thinking that if I moved, it would know I was awake. Then the shape finally pulled away, back toward the door, and vanished without making a single sound. I never saw it again. Maybe that is because there was never anything there to begin with. But for those few moments in the middle of the night, I was completely certain that the thing I had spent every night waiting for had finally come through my bedroom door. And even years later, that certainty is the part that still makes the memory difficult to shake. Forgive me for stepping in for just a moment. If you've only recently found your way here, then welcome. I'm glad you came. If these stories are keeping you company tonight, consider subscribing to Crowvane Manor. New stories arrive here often, the kind that stay with you long after the night is over. And if you tap the bell, you won't have to go looking. The next one will find you on its own. Thank you for being here. Now, let's return to where we left off. I was around 6 or 7 years old when the first thing happened. At that age, I was scared of sleeping alone, so a lot of the time I would sleep in my parents' bed. Being between them made me feel safe. If I woke up from a nightmare, I knew they were right there. If I heard something strange in the house, I could tell myself it was nothing, because my parents were beside me. One night, I fell asleep with them, like normal. I do not remember anything unusual before going to bed. I was not thinking about ghosts, strange women, or anything like that. As far as I remember, it was just another normal night. Then I suddenly woke up. The room was dark and quiet. My parents were still sleeping beside me. I looked toward the clock. It said around 3:30 in the morning. For some reason, I remember that time clearly. Maybe it stood out because it was so late. When you were 6 or 7, being awake at 3 in the morning feels completely different from being awake during the day. The whole house feels abandoned, even though everyone is still there. I lay there for a moment. Then I saw someone. There was a woman in the room. She was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dress. The middle part seemed black, while the outside or edges of the dress looked purple. I did not recognize her. She was not my mother. She was not anyone I remembered seeing before. At first, I just stared. I do not remember her suddenly appearing. In my memory, she was simply there. Then she started walking toward me. Slowly, I froze. My parents were right beside me, but somehow that did not make me feel safer. I remember wanting to wake them. I wanted to scream. I wanted one of them to open their eyes and prove that they could see her too. But I did not make a sound. The woman kept coming closer. I watched her cross the room until she was directly in front of me. Then she stopped. She stared at me. That was probably the most frightening part. She did not say anything. She did not reach toward me. She did not touch me. She simply looked at me. I remember being terrified because I could not understand why a strange woman was standing over me in the middle of the night. Then she disappeared. I do not remember her walking away. One moment, she was there. Then, she was not. I immediately looked at the clock again. 3:33. Only a few minutes seemed to have passed. That made the whole thing feel even stranger. I was about to scream and wake my parents. I remember thinking that I needed to tell them there had been someone in the room. But before I could really do anything, I fell asleep again. That part confused me later. I had just been terrified. My heart should have been racing. I should have been shaking my parents awake. Instead, I somehow went straight back to sleep. Then I had one of the worst dreams I can remember from childhood. There were people in it who had holes all over their bodies. I do not remember the entire dream anymore. Most of it has faded. What stayed with me was the image of those people. Their bodies looked wrong. There were holes everywhere. It was disturbing enough that the dream became connected in my mind with the woman I had seen just before falling asleep. For years, I thought about those two things as part of the same night. The woman. Then, the dream. At that age, I did not have a good explanation for either one. I knew dreams could be scary, but the woman had not felt like a dream. I remembered waking up. I remembered looking at the clock. I remembered seeing my parents beside me. I remembered watching her move toward me. So in my mind, she had been real. Then, a few years later, something happened that brought the memory back. By then, I was about 9 years old. My class started reading a book called The Queen's Own Grove. The narrator and main character was a girl named Amelia. At the front of the book there was a drawing of Amelia. The moment I saw that illustration, I felt uncomfortable. She reminded me of the woman I had seen that night. Not just a little. At least in my memory, the resemblance felt strong. It was enough to make me think back to being 6 or 7, lying beside my parents. Watching that woman in the old-fashioned black and purple dress come toward me. Seeing the picture made the old experience feel more real again. I started wondering how I could have seen someone years before seeing a drawing that looked like her. Had I somehow seen the image before? Had the woman been connected to the story? Was it just coincidence? At 9, those questions were frightening. The simplest explanation did not feel satisfying because I remembered the woman coming before the book. But as I got older, I realized memory does not always work as cleanly as we think it does. It is possible that I had seen artwork similar to Amelia somewhere before that night. Maybe on another book, maybe on television, maybe in a movie, maybe in a picture at school. Children see thousands of faces, costumes, illustrations, and characters without remembering where they came from. Then, years later, when something looks familiar, the mind can connect it to an older memory. It could also be that Amelia did not look exactly like the woman at all. Maybe there were only a few similarities. Long hair, old-fashioned clothing, the shape of the face, a serious expression. That might have been enough. Once I thought, that looks like the woman, the resemblance could have become stronger in memory. That does not mean I was making it up. It means memories can influence each other. The face I remembered from age 6 may have become more like the drawing I saw at 9, or the drawing may have seemed more like the woman, because I already had a frightening female figure stored in my memory. Either way, seeing Amelia brought everything back. There is also a normal explanation for the original sighting that makes sense to me now. I had woken in the middle of the night. I was still lying in bed. I had only been awake for a short time. That is exactly when dream imagery can sometimes continue into the waking world. You can feel completely awake. You can see the room. You can recognize the clock. You can know who is sleeping beside you. And yet, part of the brain may still be producing dream-like images. A person can appear in the room. A shadow can seem to move. Someone can stand beside the bed. The experience can feel more real than an ordinary dream because the bedroom itself is real. I cannot say for certain that this is what happened to me, but it would explain a lot. It would explain why the woman appeared in the bedroom without making any sound. It would explain why my parents did not wake up. It would explain why she disappeared instead of leaving normally. And it would especially explain why I fell asleep again almost immediately afterward. If I was never fully awake, then the whole event may have happened during that strange transition between sleeping and waking. The clock does not rule that out. I could have genuinely opened my eyes and seen 3:30. Then, while still half asleep, experienced the woman. Later, I looked again and saw 3:33. The real room and dream imagery could have overlapped. At 6 or 7, I had no way to know that was possible. To me, eyes open meant awake. Awake meant real. There was no middle ground. The old-fashioned dress could also have come from somewhere in my imagination. Children absorb visual information constantly. Fairy tales, cartoons, books, religious images, period movies, pictures of queens and princesses. A black and purple dress sounds specific now, but those colors and styles are common in fantasy and older clothing. My sleeping brain could easily have created a woman from pieces of things I had seen. The fact that she did not speak or interact physically also fits that possibility. She behaved more like an image than a real intruder. She approached, stared, disappeared. Nothing else in the room changed. The dream about people with holes in their bodies may simply have been the next stage of the same nightmare. The frightening woman raised my fear. Then my brain continued building disturbing images after I fell deeper asleep. Because the experiences happened close together, I naturally treated them as connected. Maybe they were connected, just not in a supernatural way. They may have come from the same frightened, half-asleep mind. Still, I understand why the memory stayed with me. Seeing a stranger beside your parents' bed is terrifying at any age, and because I remembered the clock, the event had a feeling of structure. 3:30. Woman appears. 3:33. She disappears. Then nightmare. It felt like something had happened during those 3 minutes. The exact time made it seem more real. But time perception in the middle of the night is unreliable, too. Maybe I looked at the clock before and after. Maybe I only clearly remember the second time. Maybe the numbers became more important during later retellings. That is possible. I do not like assuming every childhood memory is perfectly recorded just because it feels vivid. The emotional parts are often stronger than the factual ones. Fear lasts. Small details can shift. There was another strange experience from around the same period of my childhood. I was maybe 7 or 8 when this one happened. It involved Chara, the character from Undertale. This experience was shorter. I had just woken up. Again, that detail matters. I was not running around during the afternoon. I was coming out of sleep, and I saw what looked like Chara, except the face was wrong. The eyes looked like they were melting. That is the best way I can describe them. Distorted, unnatural, creepy in a way that made the character immediately frightening. Then I heard or understood 2 things: get out and help me. That was it. The experience was extremely short, but it scared me. Looking back, I think this one has an even stronger sleep-related explanation than the woman. Chara was already a fictional character I knew. My brain did not have to invent a completely unfamiliar person. It already had an image available. All it had to do was distort it. Melting eyes, a threatening expression, a few words. That is exactly the kind of thing dreams do. They take something familiar and change one feature until it becomes horrifying. A character you recognize suddenly has the wrong face. A friendly person speaks in the wrong voice. A normal room contains something impossible. And because I had just woken up, some of that imagery may have remained for a few seconds. The phrases "get out" and "help me" are also interesting because they point in opposite directions. Get out sounds like a warning or threat. Help me sounds like a request. If this had been some clear supernatural message, I would expect it to make more sense. Instead, the contradiction feels dreamlike. Dreams do not always follow normal logic. A character can be dangerous and helpless at the same time. Something can tell you to leave while also begging you to stay. The emotional meaning matters more than the literal meaning. Both phrases create urgency. Something is wrong. Move, help, danger, that may be all my brain was trying to express. At the time, of course, I was not analyzing any of that. I just saw a frightening version of a character I knew and heard words that scared me. The fact that both of my strongest childhood experiences happened right after waking is important. That creates a pattern, but probably not the paranormal pattern I would have assumed when I was younger. It may mean I was simply prone to vivid dream imagery around waking. Some children have very intense nightmares. Some wake confused. Some briefly see shapes, people, or objects that disappear once they become fully alert. That does not automatically mean anything is medically wrong, and I would not try to diagnose my younger self from a couple of memories. But it provides a reasonable explanation. It also explains why these things stopped becoming such a big part of my life as I got older. Sleep changes with age. Fear changes. The imagination changes. You learn what shadows look like. You become better at recognizing when a dream is still influencing you. A 6-year-old who sees a woman beside the bed may think a ghost visited. An adult might blink, turn on a light, and realize they were still half dreaming. That difference alone can make childhood seem much more supernatural. The book illustration bothered me for a long time because it felt like confirmation. I saw her first. Then years later, I saw the same face in a book. How could that happen? But similarities between faces are everywhere. Artists use familiar visual patterns. Old-fashioned female characters often have similar hairstyles and clothing. The human brain is also very good at finding matches. Once we are looking for resemblance, we notice it. Maybe Amelia only shared the general appearance of the woman. Maybe that was enough to trigger the memory. There is also a possibility I had seen the book somewhere before my class officially read it. Maybe in a library. Maybe on a shelf. Maybe another student had it. Maybe I passed the cover years earlier and forgot. I have no memory of doing that. But lack of memory does not prove it never happened. Children see books constantly without paying attention to titles. A picture can enter your memory without the surrounding context. Later, a dream uses it. Years later, you see the picture again and think the dream predicted it. That is one possible explanation. The same thing happens with dreams that seem to predict future events. You dream hundreds of random situations. Most are forgotten. Then something similar happens months later. Suddenly, the old dream returns. It feels impossible because you remember the match, not the thousands of dreams that matched nothing. I am not saying every strange coincidence is meaningless. I am saying the brain is very good at connecting patterns after the fact. That may be what happened with Amelia. Even so, the woman on the night I was 6 or 7 feels different from an ordinary nightmare in my memory. I can still imagine the room, my parents sleeping, the clock glowing, the woman standing there, the old dress, black in the middle, purple around the outside, her coming closer, stopping right in front of me, staring, then nothing. If it was a waking dream, it was incredibly convincing. Maybe that is why people throughout history have reported figures beside their beds. Before anyone knew much about sleep states, what else would they call them? Ghosts, demons, spirits, visitors. The experience feels external because the person does not feel like they are dreaming. I understand that now. It still does not make the memory pleasant. The dream that followed was almost worse in a different way. People with holes all over their bodies. I do not remember whether they were chasing me. I do not remember where I was. Only the bodies. Sometimes one disturbing image survives after the rest of a nightmare disappears. That was one of those images. Because it came right after the woman, I spent years treating the dream as if she had caused it. Maybe she had shown me something. Maybe the dream was some kind of message. That is how a child thinks. Now I think my fear probably caused the dream. I saw something frightening while half awake. My brain stayed frightened. Then I fell asleep and continued dreaming in the same emotional state. That is much simpler. The Chara experience probably worked the same way. Wake, familiar bedroom, fictional character appears, face distorted, short, frightening message. Then fully awake. The more I compare the two incidents, the more that explanation fits. But I do not want to pretend I can reconstruct exactly what happened years later. I cannot. The memories are old. I was a child. Some details may be accurate, others may have changed. What I can say is that I genuinely experienced them as real at the time. I did not sit there inventing a ghost story. I was scared. The fear stayed long enough that I still remember the experiences now. Sometimes that is the hardest part about explaining childhood encounters. An adult says, "You were dreaming." And maybe they are right. But to the child, that can sound like nothing happened. Something did happen. The experience happened. The terror happened. The image happened in the mind strongly enough to be remembered years later. The question is whether there was an actual person or entity in the room. That is the uncertain part. Personally, I think the timing around waking provides the strongest clue. Both times I had just come out of sleep. The first time, I was able to fall asleep again almost immediately. The second involved a known fictional character in a distorted form. Those details strongly point toward the mind rather than an outside presence. And yet, if you ask what scared me most, it was never Chara. That image was creepy. The melting eyes were disturbing. Get out. Help me. I remember it. But the woman was worse, because she did not belong to anything I recognized at the time. She was just there. A stranger. And strangers beside your bed are more frightening than monsters you already know are fictional. Then the book gave her a face that seemed to belong somewhere. Amelia, That made me wonder whether the woman had been unfamiliar only because I had not seen the story yet. That idea frightened me for a long time. Now, I think it is more likely that memory moved in the opposite direction. I saw Amelia. She resembled the old memory. The two became connected. Each time I remembered the woman afterward, the picture from the book may have influenced her appearance a little more. Eventually, it became difficult to separate what I saw at 6 from what I saw printed on a page at 9. That happens. Memory is not a photograph locked away untouched. Every time we remember something, we rebuild it. New information can enter. That does not erase the original event. It simply means I cannot use the later resemblance as proof. So I am left with two childhood experiences that both have reasonable explanations. A half-awake child seeing a woman in the room, a later nightmare. A familiar illustration triggering the old memory. Then, another half-awake moment where a video game character appeared distorted and seemed to speak. None of those require ghosts. None prove anything supernatural. But they explain why, as a child, I sometimes felt as if sleep was not a clean boundary. I could wake up and still feel like something from somewhere else had followed me into the room. Most of the time, nothing happened. I slept normally. My parents slept normally. Morning came. But those 2 nights stayed, especially the first one. I can still picture myself lying between my parents, looking at the clock. 3:30. Then the woman, old dress, black, purple, walking closer without saying a word, standing right in front of me, staring, gone, then the clock again. 3:33. I wanted to scream. I wanted to wake my parents. Instead, sleep pulled me back down almost immediately. And the next thing waiting for me was a nightmare full of people whose bodies were covered in holes. Years later, I would see Amelia in the Queen's Own Grove and feel that same old fear because to me, she looked like the woman from that night. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe a forgotten image had influenced the dream. Maybe the resemblance grew stronger every time I remembered it. Those explanations make sense. They are probably closer to the truth than anything paranormal. And the Kara experience, with the melting eyes and the words, "Get out and help me," was probably another moment when my brain woke, before the dream had completely ended. That is what I believe now. But there is still one part of the first experience that feels exactly the same whenever I remember it. The woman never rushed me. She never screamed. She never tried to hurt me. She simply crossed the dark room, stopped directly in front of a frightened child lying between 2 sleeping parents, and stared until the clock had moved from 3:30 to 3:33. Then she disappeared. And somehow, instead of screaming, I closed my eyes and fell straight back into another nightmare. A friend of mine was staying over at my house, and as usual, I was the last one awake. I have always had a terrible time falling asleep. Even when I am exhausted, my brain does not seem to understand that nighttime is supposed to mean shutting down. I can lie there for what feels like forever, listening to every tiny sound in the room and waiting for sleep to finally happen. That night was worse because we had only recently moved into the house. Everything still felt unfamiliar. The sounds were different. The room was different. Even the darkness felt different. I did not exactly live in the nicest neighborhood either, so I was already the kind of person who paid attention to noises outside. A car slowing down, somebody walking past, something moving near the house, my mind would immediately start wondering what it was. Normally, I slept with some kind of small light on. It did not have to be bright. I just hated waking up in complete darkness. I wake up several times during the night, and there is something about opening your eyes and seeing absolutely nothing that makes my brain panic before I even know where I am. I always called it waking up to the black abyss. But because we had just moved, we had not found a small light yet that we wanted to leave running every night. So that night, the bedroom was completely dark. The only light came from my phone whenever I checked it. I would turn the screen on every once in a while, look at the time, maybe scroll for a few minutes, and then turn it off again. Every time the screen went dark, the room seemed even darker than before. My friend was lying beside me and had already fallen asleep. I could hear the soft, steady breathing that told me she was completely gone for the night. Meanwhile, I was just lying there awake. I tried closing my eyes, opened them again, checked my phone, put it down, tried turning on to my other side. Nothing worked. Eventually, I stopped trying so hard and just lay there staring into the darkness. That was when the room started feeling different. The best way I can describe it is that I suddenly felt something cold. Not exactly a draft. Not just that the room temperature dropped. It felt more like a presence. At least that is how I interpreted it at the time. I had heard people describe that kind of thing before. The sudden feeling that someone else is in the room. The temperature seems different. Your skin reacts. Every hair rises before you even know why. I was not completely unfamiliar with stories about paranormal things either. My mother had grown up around family members who believed strongly in that kind of stuff. Some of her aunts were supposedly witches, or at least that was the family story I had always heard. Because of that, my mother had given me one very specific rule when I was younger. If I ever saw or heard something strange that I thought might be paranormal, do not interact with it. Do not speak to it. Do not invite it closer. Do not answer it. Just ignore it if possible. I do not know whether she genuinely believed something would happen or whether she simply knew that interacting with something frightening would make me panic more. Either way, I remembered that advice immediately. So when I started feeling like something was in the room, I did not call out. I did not say, "Who's there?" I stayed quiet. For a little while, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. The room was unfamiliar. It was late. I was tired. I was already nervous because the neighborhood was not great. There were plenty of reasons for me to feel uncomfortable. Then I looked toward the bathroom. My bedroom had its own bathroom connected to it. The bathroom entrance was visible from the bed, though in the darkness I could only make out general shapes. I tilted my head slightly so I could see past my friend. And that was when I saw her. Or at least, that was when I saw something my mind immediately understood as a woman. She was tall, lanky, thin in a way that looked wrong. I could not make out a normal face. I do not remember seeing clear clothing either. The darkness took away most of the details. But the shape seemed feminine enough that I have always called it a woman. She was coming from the bathroom. I froze. There was no thought of getting up, no thought of checking whether someone had broken into the house. I immediately remembered what my mother had told me. Do not interact. So I moved slightly and pretended to be asleep. I closed my eyes, or at least I mostly closed them. Every few seconds, I would open them just enough to look. I know that probably sounds ridiculous. If I was truly trying to pretend I was asleep, peeking at the figure was not exactly helping. But I could not stop myself. I was terrified of seeing what it would do. I was also terrified of not seeing what it would do. So I stayed still, barely breathing, opening my eyes just a little. Watching, the figure did not come directly toward my face. It moved closer to the bed. Then it lowered itself toward the floor. That is the part that becomes difficult to describe. It looked like the woman lay down beside the bed. Not on the bed, on the floor, right next to me. I remember thinking that this was somehow worse than if she had just stood there. Standing would have made sense. A person stands. A person walks. But lowering herself onto the floor right beside the bed felt deliberate, like she wanted to stay close while remaining below my line of sight. I kept pretending to sleep. Then her body started changing. It seemed to spread, expand. That is the only word I have for it. The shape stretched outward across the floor, not like somebody slowly extending their arms or legs. The entire dark form seemed to become wider, flatter, less human. It spread until it stopped looking like a body at all. Then, there was nothing. She was gone. I remember staring at the place beside the bed. Nothing moved. No figure stood up. Nobody walked back into the bathroom. There were no footsteps, no door, no sound of fabric. The shape simply became less defined until I could not see it anymore. I shut my eyes. I tried to sleep. There was absolutely no chance of that happening. I stayed awake for the rest of the night. Every sound made me tense. Every time my friend moved beside me, I almost jumped. I wanted to wake her up, but part of me worried that speaking would somehow count as interacting with whatever I had seen. Another part of me did not want to sound insane. What was I supposed to say? Hey, wake up. A weird, stretchy woman just came out of my bathroom, lay on the floor, expanded, and disappeared. Even to me, it sounded ridiculous. So I stayed there. Hours later, morning finally came. Daylight changed everything. The bathroom looked normal. The floor beside the bed was empty. Nothing was damaged. There were no signs that anybody had actually entered the room. My friend woke up like nothing had happened. Eventually, I told her. She gave me the most obvious explanation. Maybe your mind was just playing tricks on you. I did not want to accept that at first. I knew what I had seen. At least, I felt like I knew. The figure had looked real. I had watched it move. I had watched it come from the bathroom. I had watched it lie beside the bed. But the more I thought about the situation later, the more I had to admit that my friend's explanation was possible. It was somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning. I was exhausted. I had been awake long after my friend fell asleep. The room was almost completely dark. I was staring into shadows while drifting in and out of tiredness. Those are not exactly ideal conditions for perfect vision. Even if I never fully fell asleep, my brain may have been close enough to sleep that dream like imagery started mixing with the room. People do not always go cleanly from awake to asleep. There is a transition. Thoughts become strange. Images appear. Sounds can seem different. Sometimes you can still see your actual bedroom while the brain begins producing dream material. I cannot say for certain that this is what happened to me, but it would explain a lot. A half-asleep brain could take the dark shape of the bathroom doorway and turn it into a person. Once I interpreted that shape as a woman, every change in shadow could become movement. The figure comes closer. The figure lowers herself. The figure spreads across the floor. Then the image fades as I become slightly more awake. That sequence makes sense. The phone probably did not help. Every time I checked it, I was exposing my eyes to a bright screen. Then I would turn it off and look into complete darkness again. Vision does not adjust instantly. After looking at a bright rectangle in a dark room, you can get afterimages. Dark patches. Bright patches. Shapes that seem to move when you shift your eyes. If I had been checking my phone repeatedly, my vision could have been full of temporary distortions. A dark human-like shape near the bathroom might have been partly an afterimage. Then, when I moved my eyes slightly, the shape could appear to stretch or expand. That is particularly interesting because of how the figure disappeared. It did not walk out. It spread until it became nothing. That sounds less like a physical person and more like a visual effect changing shape as my eyes adjusted. At the time, though, I did not think about afterimages. I thought there was something in my room. The fact that I already knew paranormal stories probably influenced what I saw, too. If I had never heard anything about ghosts or witches, maybe the strange shape would have been interpreted differently. Maybe I would have thought somebody had broken in. Maybe I would have turned on the light. Instead, my mother's warning immediately came into my head. Do not interact. That gave the experience a supernatural frame before I had even confirmed what I was looking at. Once I thought this could be something paranormal, every detail became more frightening. The cold feeling became a presence. The dark shape became a woman. Her movement became unnatural. Her disappearance became proof that she could not have been human. But each of those things has other possible explanations. The cold feeling could have been a normal temperature change. The bathroom may have had different airflow. Air conditioning could have turned on. A window or vent could have let cooler air move through the room. Even fear itself can create a cold sensation. Your skin changes. You get goosebumps. The hairs on your arms rise. You can feel chilled even if the actual room temperature has barely changed. So it is possible that the presence started with my own body becoming anxious. And anxiety would make sense. I was awake in a dark, unfamiliar room in a recently moved into house, in a neighborhood I already did not completely trust. My friend was asleep. I felt alone even though she was right beside me. That is enough to make anybody more alert. There might also have been ordinary objects near the bathroom that looked human in the dark. Clothes, a towel, something hanging from the door, a long shadow. Furniture. When we had just moved in, there may have been boxes or other things sitting around that were not usually there. A pile of objects can create a surprisingly human silhouette when you cannot see details. Then, if the light from outside changed, the shape would seem to move. A car passing on the street could send headlights through a window. The light could travel across the room and make a shadow stretch. That would explain the expanding body almost perfectly. Imagine a dark object creating a tall shadow near the bathroom. A distant car changes angle. The shadow moves down the wall or floor. It stretches, then disappears. To someone wide awake in daylight, obvious. To someone exhausted at 3 a.m. staring through half-closed eyes, it could become a lanky woman lying beside the bed. I do not remember hearing a car. But I also would not necessarily have noticed one if my attention was locked onto the figure. There is another clue that makes me think sleep was involved. I was pretending to sleep while watching through barely opened eyes. That would make vision even worse. Looking through your eyelashes can distort light. Shapes blur. Edges become strange. Your eyes may also move slightly, while you try to keep them almost closed. A shadow can look like it is changing size, when really your eyelids and focus are changing. The figures spreading across the floor could have been the visual shape breaking apart as my eyes lost focus. Again, that is something I understand now. At the time, it looked like a body expanding until there was nothing left. I also never heard the figure. That matters. No footsteps coming from the bathroom. No weight on the floor. No clothing moving. No breathing. Nothing touching the bed. Nothing knocking into furniture. For something tall enough to look like a lanky woman to physically cross the room and lie beside the bed, I would expect at least some sound, especially at that hour when everything was silent. The complete lack of noise makes a visual misperception more plausible. The figure also never interacted with my friend. She was lying right next to me. If a physical person walked from the bathroom to the bed, there would have been a good chance my friend would wake up. Instead, she slept through everything. That does not prove nothing happened. Some people can sleep through a lot. But again, it points toward the experience being something only I was perceiving. There is another possibility that I do not like, but cannot completely rule out. There could have been an actual person. The neighborhood made that thought especially frightening. Maybe someone was in the bathroom. Maybe they entered somehow. But the way the figure disappeared makes that unlikely. A real intruder cannot flatten into nothing. And the next morning, there was no evidence that somebody had been inside. Nothing missing. No damaged window. No open door. No signs of forced entry. So I think an actual person is less likely than either a sleep-related image or shadows. Eventually, I told my mother enough of the story that she agreed to bless the room. I put that in quotation marks because it was not some elaborate ritual. She burned sage and left it in the middle of my room. That was pretty much it. But to me, it made a difference. Nothing else really happened afterward. At the time, that felt like confirmation. We did something to cleanse the room. The figure never returned. Therefore, whatever had been there was gone. But there are other ways to interpret that. The sage ritual may simply have made me feel safer. Feeling safer matters when you are trying to sleep. If I went to bed thinking my mother had protected the room, I was less likely to lie awake scanning the bathroom for movement. Less scanning means fewer shadows becoming people. Less fear means fewer physical sensations being interpreted as a presence. Eventually, we probably got the small light I wanted too. That alone would change everything. A dim light gives the brain more visual information. The bathroom doorway becomes a doorway again. A pile of clothes becomes clothes. A shadow becomes obviously attached to an object. Nothing supernatural has to leave the room. You simply stop giving darkness enough ambiguity to create something frightening. That does not mean the sage did nothing. If it gave me comfort, then it had a real effect. It just may have worked through reassurance rather than by forcing an entity out. I also think the family stories about witches affected me more than I realized. When you grow up hearing that certain relatives were involved in unusual spiritual things, the supernatural never feels completely impossible. Even if you do not strongly believe it, the possibility is already built into your worldview. So when something strange happens, your brain has somewhere to place it. A presence, a spirit, something that should not be spoken to. That can make an unclear nighttime experience much more intense. My mother's advice probably helped in one way. I stayed still instead of walking toward an unknown figure in the dark. If it had somehow been a real person, staying quiet and assessing the situation might have been safer than approaching. But psychologically, her warning also made the event feel more paranormal. I was already following the rules for dealing with a ghost before I knew whether there was a ghost. That is powerful suggestion. Years later, I still remember the figure. The long, thin shape. The feeling that it was feminine, coming out of the bathroom, lowering itself beside the bed, then spreading. That last image is the one I have the hardest time describing to people. A body should not move like that. That is exactly why I now suspect the body may never have been a solid object. If it were a shadow or sleep-generated image, expanding would not be impossible. Shadows stretch. Afterimages spread. Dream figures distort. Real bodies do not. That makes the strangest part of the event one of the strongest clues toward a normal explanation. I also never saw a clear face. That is another clue. When people see something in darkness, the brain often supplies a category without supplying detail. Woman, man, child, figure, you know what it is before you can describe a single feature. That is what happened to me. I called it a woman because that was the impression. But I cannot tell you eye color. I cannot describe a nose. I cannot tell you what she was wearing. There was no detailed person there in my memory. There was a human-like shape. Fear did the rest. If I had turned my phone flashlight on immediately, the entire experience might have ended in 1 second. Maybe I would have seen a towel hanging near the bathroom. Maybe there would have been nothing at all. But I did not do that. I followed my mother's advice. I did not interact. I pretended to sleep. And because I never tested what I was seeing, the mystery survived. That is common in frightening experiences. The safest reaction often leaves the fewest answers. You do not approach. You do not turn on a light. You do not investigate. You wait until the danger seems gone. Then later, when you are safe, you wonder what would have happened if you had looked closer. I am glad I did not try touching it. I am glad I did not get out of bed. Not because I am convinced it was paranormal, but because I was frightened and half asleep. Stumbling around a dark, unfamiliar room while panicking would not have helped anything. The next morning was the correct time to check, and in daylight, there was nothing there. That is the most important part. No physical evidence, no repeated sighting, no continuing disturbance. After my mother burned sage, life returned to normal. Maybe the timing was meaningful. Maybe it was coincidence. Either way, I never had another experience exactly like it. I still do not know what I saw. If I had to choose now, I would probably say it was some combination of sleep deprivation, darkness, afterimages from my phone, and fear. Maybe a shadow near the bathroom became a woman because I was already on edge. Maybe as my eyes adjusted, the shadow changed shape and appeared to lie down. Maybe the expansion was simply the image dissolving as I became more awake. That explanation fits better than a physical woman stretching into nothing. But when I think back to the actual night, logic comes second. The memory starts with the feeling. That sudden cold, the certainty that I was no longer alone, my friend asleep beside me, the room completely black, me remembering my mother telling me never to speak to anything strange, then turning my head just enough to look past my friend, and seeing a tall, thin woman-shaped figure coming out of the bathroom. I remember shifting under the covers, closing my eyes, then opening them only slightly, checking, still there, closer, then down beside the bed. I remember thinking that if I stayed completely still, maybe she would think I was asleep. And then I watched what looked like her body slowly spread across the floor until there was no recognizable body left at all. Nothing walked away. Nothing opened a door. There was simply darkness again. Maybe that is all it had ever been. Darkness, exhaustion, and my brain giving a shape to something it could not understand. That is probably the explanation I would accept now, but I still prefer sleeping with some kind of light on. And whenever I am awake at 2 or 3 in the morning with a dark bathroom doorway somewhere in my room, I cannot help remembering the one night when I looked toward mine and thought I saw something impossibly thin coming out of it. The sage may have had nothing to do with why it never happened again. Maybe there was never anything there to remove. But I did not argue when my mother burned it. After spending an entire night pretending to sleep while a lanky figure seemed to lie beside my bed and dissolve into the floor, I was willing to take whatever reassurance I could get. If you've stayed with me this far, then these stories didn't simply pass the time. They stayed with you. Everything you heard tonight was real. Real people. Real moments. And in each one, something quietly slipped out of place. If you'd like more of the kind that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Crowvane Manor. There are more rooms left open and more stories waiting behind every door. I'm grateful you spent this part of your night here. Rest well, and I'll be waiting when you return.